populations with a high prevalence of anemia, like in India, and also this is much more expensive than fasting glucose or glucose measurements in biochemistry laboratories. Even in Scotland now, we have to persuade our laboratory colleagues that HbA1c is an acceptable test. They would much rather that glucose and fasting glucose were used. So that was to illustrate, and then the Venn diagram on the right is to highlight that these different tests pick up different populations. So depending on which test you use to make the diagnosis, you identify different people. And again, this complicates the study of trends over time. So again, it's really important to acknowledge the amazing work that Mohan and Anjana have done to describe, better improve the understanding of epidemiology in the Indian population. And I think what this particular study highlights is that it's a bit more complicated than just having type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And within both, but particularly type 2 diabetes, there are separate phenotypes of diabetes. And this is important for a variety of reasons. One is choosing the treatment, but also the implications for the longer term complications and so forth. And so, interestingly, there are different subtypes in the Indian population from European populations. I'm going to show the Scandinavian data later. And so, different heterogeneity within type 2 diabetes. So these are the Swedish data. There are more subtypes identified here because in the Swedish study they were able to measure autoantibodies. So they were able to split the insulin deficient group into two subgroups, those with antibodies, GADA positive, and those with who were GADA negative. And interestingly, over my working career, when I first started doing diabetes clinics in the late 80s, the population of people with diabetes we saw in British diabetes clinics there was a far higher proportion of the insulin deficient type of subtype of type 2 diabetes. And what we've seen over time in that 30 or so years is that we've seen much more obesity-related diabetes now, and it's a different phenotype. And so this changing phenotype of diabetes will be contributing to the different patterns and trends and complications. I'm going to talk briefly about type 1 diabetes. So most of the work on epidemiology of type 1 diabetes, particularly incidence, has been done in children, so under 15-year-olds. Now in Scotland, half of the type 1 diabetes is diagnosed in adults, so people over 18. So we've got a gap in the understanding of later onset type 1 diabetes. And so you see from these estimates from the International Diabetes Federation that suggest that incidence of type 1 diabetes in children in India is still relatively low compared to the rest of the world. But clearly it's a devastating condition, having type 1 diabetes in childhood. And so it might have low incidence, low prevalence, but it's still really important for the health of the population. I'm now showing some data on incidence in Scotland. So this, I'm sorry the text is a bit small, but this goes back to 1968. And so these patterns of incidence of type 1 diabetes essentially reflect what is seen in Northern Europe. So between about 1968 and 1983, there was a steep increase in incidence. Between 1983 and about 2005, still increasing incidence, but not as sharply. But this work from a student that's just come out in the paper version of Diabetic Medicine yesterday showed that from about 2006 to 2019, we haven't seen any increases in type 1 incidence in Scotland. And very similar patterns have been seen in Finland and Sweden and other high type 1 incidence countries. So it'd be really interesting as more data are gathered in India to see what's happening to patterns of type 1 in India. Ed has shown some of these data already, as this is a different slide from the same paper. showing that there's evidence from selected countries that, much to our surprise, incidence overall diabetes, this is, but it's heavily weighted to type 2 diabetes, is actually coming down in recent years. And this really surprised all of us. And so it's fantastic to have Dr. Yajnik's talk earlier today, because when I presented these data to colleagues in Southampton, Caroline Ford said, David Barker said this would happen. He predicted that we would see this happen, partly because of reducing fetal malnutrition. So, and as Ranjan said, you can get the worst combination is to be a thin baby and a fat adult. And so what we're seeing in some countries now is that we're seeing fewer thin babies. So even though we're still seeing plenty of fat adults, because that obesity is being seen in the background of not being a malnourished baby, you can perhaps get away with it. So that's one of the explanations that I've heard that I thought was a really interesting explanation for these patterns. There are others, as Ed indicated, and perhaps changes in diagnostic criteria may also contribute. So, declining incidence, but still increasing prevalence, as Ed has already said. And so these are data from the International Diabetes Federation Atlas. So showing the blue is the current estimates, the orange is the future projections. And so there are several things to take away from this talk. So first of all, that the projections have been underestimates. So I was fortunate enough to be based at WHO in 2000 and contribute to the global burden of disease estimates for diabetes then. We predicted that by 2030 there'd be 366 million people with diabetes in the world in 2030.